When I talk about universal health care, there's always a discussion about should we require all American citizens to hold health insurance. In a lot of universal health care systems, the countries require their citizens to hold some sort of health care. However, I've been getting this comment a lot in those posts that essentially states that we can't enact a universal mandate or a requirement for everyone to have health insurance because the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. And as an economist who studies how we pay for healthcare, I want to dispel this myth because this isn't exactly what happened with the individual mandate and why it no longer exists. Now, when the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, it required all Americans to have some sort of health insurance. And if they didn't have that requirement by 2014, they would have to pay a tax penalty. This is known as the individual mandate. And as I mentioned before, it's very common in universal healthcare systems to help stabilize insurance markets. However, there was a lot of pushback from more conservative politicians and organizations about the constitutionality of something like the individual mandate, of essentially forcing, in their words, people to pay a tax if they chose not to have health insurance. And so this led to 26 states and various organizations, including the National Federation of Independent Business, or NBIS, to sue the Department of Health and Human Services, who was led by the secretary at the time, Kathleen Sebelius. This Supreme Court case, known as NBIS v. Sebelius, was heard by the Supreme Court in March of 2012. And when it was ruled on, it was declared that the individual mandate was in fact constitutional. And I'm not a lawyer, so all the lawyers, if I'm misinterpreting this, please correct me with my comments. But the legal framework behind this was the idea that Congress, in passing the individual mandate, was exercising its constitutional right to tax and spend. Now, you might be asking yourself, Sarah, then what happened to the individual mandate? Because if you don't have health insurance and you check your tax returns, you might see that you actually don't have to pay a penalty anymore. And the reason that you no longer have to pay a penalty if you don't have health insurance is because in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, otherwise known as the Trump tax cuts, the Congress effectively set the penalty for not holding health insurance to $0. And this reduction of the individual mandate penalty to $0 came after previous attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act altogether. Now, there was another Supreme Court case in 2021 known as California v. Texas that essentially threatened the constitutionality again of the Affordable Care Act. This is because Texas, along with 17 other states, argued that a $0 penalty meant that the mandate was no longer a valid tax and therefore unconstitutional. They also further argued that the ACA had to be struck down in its entirety because the individual mandate could not be separated from the rest of the law. And interestingly, the Supreme Court ruled that Texas had no legal standing in this lawsuit because they did not have any evidence of injury. However, the Supreme Court never ruled about the constitutionality of the mandate itself, which means we still effectively have an individual mandate. It's just effectively useless because the penalty is set to $0. Now, there was a big concern among health economists when the penalty was set to zero that we would experience insurance unraveling in the market, right? If people are able to leave the insurance market, that destabilizes the insurance market, as we've talked about previously, and it could cause insurance unraveling. We did see a small bump in the number of uninsured people once the penalty was set to zero, but there wasn't this concerning level of unraveling. Now, this was probably because the individual mandate penalty was not large enough, right, to deter people from leaving the health insurance system. And so, in theory, if we wanted to institute a universal healthcare system and, like in a lot of other universal healthcare systems, require that everyone hold some sort of health insurance in order to stabilize insurance markets, we could institute that because the Supreme Court up until now has not declared that individual mandate unconstitutional. Now, like a lot of things as it comes to the courts, that can always change, but it would require another lawsuit in order to do so. Please keep these questions about universal healthcare coming. I'll do my best to answer it. But for now, that's all I got. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know.